Before I start my talk, I want to give you a trigger warning. This talk will mention various types of abuse, ranging from emotional violence to physical and sexual violence. I'm not sure if you've heard of Gone Girl or The Girl on the Train, but these books and the movie versions of these books made quite a splash. And the reason they made quite a splash is because of how unique they are in terms of their plot lines. Both these novels fall into a category of contemporary crime fiction called domestic noir or even chick noir, and novels of this type prominently feature female protagonists. You'll say, oh, but there are lots of mystery novels with female protagonists. That is true. But not all of them feature female protagonists who move successfully from female victim to triumphing over their male abusers, quite like the female protagonists of domestic noir. Crime fiction in general has been very male-centered, with primarily male protagonists telling stories of macho men with lots of violence. Guns and explosions, which is all fine. I love stories with guns and explosions. But in these stories, what are the women doing? If there are any playing an important role at all, it's usually as the love interest, who could be a virginal type or a mysterious seductress. Either way, she's usually a secondary character. Oh, there is another role that women almost always play in male-centered crime fiction. Can you take a guess? It's as the victim, who is often just a corpse and is also often sexualized for some reason. So that's women in male-centric crime fiction, which is most crime fiction. Of course, there is more to it, but we simply don't have the time. If you take a look at most of the female protagonists of crime fiction, you'll see that a good chunk of them have very traumatic life histories that often involve gender-based crimes like rape and sexual assault, either of them or of a close female relative or friend. These female protagonists are also working in male-dominated fields like law enforcement and struggle with misogyny in the workplace. Patricia Cornwell's Dr. Case Carpenter, Tess Gerritsen's Jane Rizzoli and Maura Isles, Karen Slaughter's Sarah Linton, and Lena Adams are examples of such female protagonists. This begs the question whether experiencing brutal violence is a prerequisite for a female detective, and whether justice is possible if the detective herself is unsafe from gender-based crimes. While these women are independent and brave, excelling in their chosen fields, they are nevertheless targets of male abusers, and the women remain trapped within a system that pretty much works against them. Domestic noir is a little different. Yes, the subgenre features women being trapped in unhappy marriages, women being abused, women being murdered, but in most cases, the female protagonist emerges victorious over her male abusers either by killing them, which is silencing them literally and very permanently, or silencing them in a symbolic way. Whichever way you look at it, the female protagonists are taking back their lives, regaining their lost voices and their lost agency. And that's what my research is about. I'm interested in how the female protagonists of domestic noir move from their role of victim to the role of perpetrator. I focus on the journey between these two roles and the strategies they employ to cope with and then finally overcome their victimhood. In this talk, I'll look at what domestic noir is, before moving on to discussing my theoretical framework, and then the critical theories used in my research, and finally, my findings. So what exactly is domestic noir? I just realized this is in the way. Okay. So what exactly is domestic noir? In a nutshell, domestic noir takes place primarily in homes and workplaces, concerns itself largely, but not exclusively, with the female experience, is based around relationships, and takes as its base a broadly feminist view that the domestic sphere is a challenging and sometimes dangerous prospect for its inhabitants. This is according to Julia Crouch, an author who was the first to use this term to describe her own novels, because she felt that labels like psychological thriller didn't quite fit her quietly intense stories of relationships going up in flames. Domestic noir, like its name suggests, focuses very much on the domestic aspect. The subgenre constantly attacks the widely held belief of the home being a safe space, highlighting how dangerous the home can be and how even the people closest to you can't be fully trusted. Sounds quite bleak, doesn't it? Well, depressingly enough, a lot of these novels are based on or inspired by real events. For example, Emma Donohue's novel Room is based on the case of Elizabeth Fritzl, who was held captive by her father, and Gillian Flynn's Gone Girl was inspired by the murder of Lacey Peterson by her husband. Domestic noir is a relatively new subgenre of crime fiction, and it became popular with the release of Gillian Flynn's novel Gone Girl in 2012. The subgenre also incorporates elements of mystery, thriller, and sometimes even the supernatural, which is part of what makes these novels so intriguing. A key feature of domestic noir is how female-centric it is. Domestic noir tells stories of women's lived experience, exploring themes and issues women often face. Being so female-centric, it is also a subversion of traditional crime fiction, like noir and hard-boiled detective novels. The female protagonists engage in what is typically known as male violence, and most importantly, the women punish their male abusers and usually get away with the crimes too. Now, there are two main types of domestic noir novels. The first focuses on the power dynamics in heterosexual marriages and romantic relationships. This type features a wife who is being abused by her male partner and often ends with the woman murdering or punishing her husband in some way. The second type explores the dysfunctional relationships between mothers and their children, usually daughters. These novels include an abusive mother who endangers the lives of her children and sometimes even murders them. My research only explores the first subtype. So this is my theoretical framework, and it is based on the idea that the female protagonists employ 5 main strategies as they move through the process of shedding their victimhood and regaining their agency. The 5 strategies are gender performance, masquerade, inversion of normative feminine and masculine behavior, recognizing their victimhood, and finally, violence. To examine these strategies, I use a range of theories. To analyze the aspect of gender performance, I've used Judith Butler's theory of performativity, Joan Rivier's concept of womanliness as a masquerade to explore masquerade, Revin Connell's gender order theory and concept of multiple masculinities, and Mimi Schippers' theory of gender hegemony and multiple masculinities and femininities to examine the inversion of normative feminine and masculine behavior, Schippers' theory of gender hegemony, and Suzanne C. Swan and David L. Snow's theory of women's use of violence in intimate relationships to analyze the strategy of embracing their victimhood, or rather recognizing their victimhood, and Swan and Snow's theory and Connell's gender order theory to examine violence. So let's take a brief look at these 5 theories. Due to the time constraints, in the discussion of the theories, I'll focus on the aspects that are relevant to the findings that I present in this talk. First up is Judith Butler's theory of performativity. As a theory, this provides an interesting view of gender. Butler suggests that gender is performative. According to Butler, gender identities are created and constituted through language, leading to behaviors that society attributes to the female and male sexes, what we call normative or stereotypical feminine and masculine behavior. For example, we associate skirts with women. Why? It's because women have been wearing skirts for a long time, and as a result, we have come to associate skirts as women's attire. So the key here is, as Butler says, the repetition of acts. Butler also makes an important distinction between gender being performed and gender being performative. In their own words, when we say gender is performed, we usually mean that we've taken on a role or we're acting in some way, and that our acting or our role playing is crucial to the gender that we are and the gender that we present to the world. To say that gender is performative is a little different because for something to be performative means that it produces a series of effects. We act and walk and speak and talk in ways that consolidate an impression of being a man or being a woman. This distinction has significance when it comes to domestic noir's female protagonists, who engage in certain gendered behaviors for whatever personal agenda, often engaging in a gender performance of an idealized femininity. We'll discuss that a little more later. Next is Joan Rivier's concept of womanliness as a masquerade. The concept of masquerade is very closely connected to that of gender performance. So what exactly does womanliness as a masquerade mean? According to Joan Riviere, womanliness could be assumed and worn as a mask, both to hide the possession of masculinity and to avert the reprisals expected if she was found to possess it. Basically, this concept of womanliness as a masquerade explores how women enact an idealized femininity, usually hyperfemininity, as a mask to protect them from censure from men and society for being even a touch masculine or unfeminine. In her paper, Riviere provides some examples of this. One of her examples was of a woman she described as a capable housewife who was well versed in household matters that were typically considered masculine. But whenever, say, a builder came in for work around the house, she immediately hid all of her technical knowledge and deferred to him. Now, this may seem a little ridiculous, but this is often a subconscious behavior that women engage in to ensure that they don't display anything close to masculinity, thereby threatening men and their masculinities, and therefore the very fabric of society. The end result would be censure for the woman for possessing masculinity, which in a patriarchal society is a big no-no. In domestic noir novels, we see women putting on hegemonic femininity or hyperfemininity on as a mask to hide their own authentic expressions of gender, which often include elements of hegemonic masculinity. Now, these terms I'll be discussing in the next two slides. Connell's gender order theory and concept of multiple masculinities offers a framework to study power relations between men and women, suggesting that there are gender hierarchies that put men in positions of power and dominance that oppress women and other marginalized groups. Connell proposes that there are multiple masculinities and that these masculinities work to reinforce and maintain the continued oppression of women and other minorities. The concept of multiple masculinities itself refutes long-held assumptions about gender and masculinity, asserting that there is no fixed type of masculinity and that men do not commit to a particular pattern of masculinity, but instead make situationally specific choices from a cultural repertoire of masculine behavior. She discusses four main types of masculinities. They are hegemonic, complicit, subordinated, and marginalized. Of these, hegemonic and complicit masculinities are the ones relevant to the findings in this talk. So hegemonic masculinity is the dominant form of masculinity. It is often embodied by a minority of men, or even a cultural ideal like a film actor or a fictional character like Batman. However, other men must position themselves in relation to the men embodying hegemonic masculinity. Of course, what counts as hegemonic masculinity differs from region to region based on their concept of what it means to be a man. So, for example, while men in South and Southeast Asia wear sarongs, in the West they probably wouldn't come anywhere near those thinking they're maxi skirts. Complicit masculinity occurs when men do not actively engage in behavior that openly oppresses women and minorities, but still benefit from hegemonic masculinity practices. Although these men may not be violent towards women and may share household chores with their female partners, they still serve to gain from their position of power as men and from the overall subordination of women. This is a bit like having your cake and eating it too. Now, the thing with masculinity is that it isn't something only men enact. Women and people of other genders can also enact masculinities. This is evident in domestic noir novels, where the female protagonists are often seen enacting hegemonic masculinity. This, in turn, threatens their male partners, making the men feel that they are forced into a feminine role, because according to the patriarchy, there's only masculinity in one end and femininity on the other. Mimi Shippers' theory of gender hegemony and multiple masculinities and femininities is a reworking of Connell's gender order theory and introduces a framework to examine multiple femininities, which is mostly missing from Connell's theory. In her concept of gender hegemony, Shippers notes that gender hegemony is produced through the idealized relationship between femininity and masculinity, based on the differences between the two as well as their complementarity. This theory borrows from Judith Butler's heterosexual matrix, where gender is considered a socially constructed binary, which defines women and men as two distinct classes of people. So there are certain bodies, behaviors, personality traits, and desires that neatly match up to one or the other category. For example, we associate physical strength and violence with men and being delicate and demure with women. And of these various factors, it is the idealized characteristics that we have come to establish as hegemonic masculinity and hegemonic femininity. Shippers says that there are two types of femininities, hegemonic femininity and pariah femininity. While Connell claims that there can be no hegemonic femininity, Shippers contends that it does in fact exist, and its purpose is to maintain the gender order and to keep men in power and to keep women in a subordinate position. So in the hierarchy of gender, hegemonic femininity ranks below hegemonic masculinity and other masculinities, but ranks above other femininities. Like with hegemonic masculinity, what accounts for hegemonic femininity differs across regions and communities. But most often, hegemonic femininity is the idealized femininity of any community and has significant overlap with hyperfemininity. So hyperfemininity is described as an exaggerated adherence to a stereotypic feminine gender role. Because this is a type of traditional femininity ideology, hyperfeminine women prioritize wifehood and motherhood above their own desires and firmly believe that their primary value lies in their sexuality, which must be used to attract and sustain the romantic and sexual interests of men. Pariah femininities are those that enact and embody characteristics that are considered typically masculine, such as aggression or sexual desire for other women. Embodying these characteristics are considered a threat to both male dominance and gender hegemony. So these women are stigmatized and sanctioned. In a way, pariah femininities are essentially women enacting hegemonic masculinity, which threatens men, masculinity, and therefore the patriarchy. Finally, we have Suzanne C. Swan and David L. Snow's theory of women's use of violence in intimate relationships. This theory provides insight into how female victims of domestic violence or intimate partner violence employ violence to combat their victimhood. This model explores various factors that lead to female violence that occur in response to male violence, the various coping mechanisms used by female victims of domestic violence, and the impact of such violence on women. This theory suggests that there is a bidirectional path between a woman's and her male partner's violence, which suggests that when one partner's level of violence increases, so does the other's. This is evident in domestic noir novels when one partner's act of violence spurs on an act of violence in response. Want to know list 5 main reasons for women's motivations to become violent towards their male partners. They are self-defense, fear, defense of children, control, and retribution, all of which are applicable in domestic noir as well. Now on to the findings. In my research, I analyzed 3 novels, which have a total of 5 female protagonists and 3 male protagonists, which is quite a lot, and understandably, we don't have the time to discuss them all. So instead, I'll discuss the female protagonist of Gillian Flynn's novel Gone Girl. The protagonist's name is Amy Elliott Dunn, and I'll discuss her in terms of the 5 strategies listed in my theoretical framework, taking you through her process of shedding her victimhood and regaining her agency. But before we move on, I'll give you a brief summary of this novel for some context. So Gone Girl begins with the disappearance of the female protagonist, Amy, and the police suspect that her husband, Nick Dunn, is responsible for her murder. However, as the novel progresses, Amy informs the reader that she is in fact alive and is framing Nick for her murder to punish him for his many wrongdoings. The two are eventually reunited, and Amy blackmails Nick into staying married to her by impregnating herself with his sperm. It's a twisted tale. Gender performance and masquerade are the first 2 strategies Amy used. These 2 strategies are closely connected and often used together, so I will discuss them together. Girls and women are expected to behave in very particular ways, and this can be a very challenging experience. In order to stay true to our authentic selves, while avoiding censure for not fully conforming to patriarchal gender norms, women often engage in gender performance and masquerade. Therefore, the strategies of gender performance and masquerade in conjunction with each other are what the female protagonists of domestic noir relied on to avoid being victimized. Amy from Gone Girl also did the same, although she took it to a whole new level where she created new identities for herself in search of love and acceptance. I'll let her speak for herself. This is an example from Gone Girl, and it's the start of Amy's famous monologue about men's unrealistic expectations of women when it comes to dating. Nick loved me, but he didn't love me. Nick loved a girl who doesn't exist. I was pretending the way I often did, pretending to have a personality. The way some women change fashion regularly, I change personalities. What persona feels good, what's coveted, what's so wrong. That night at the Brooklyn party, I was playing the girl who was in style, the girl a man like Nick wants, the cool girl. In her rant, Amy describes this cool girl ideal, and it is demanding and often contradictory. Being the cool girl means I am a hot, brilliant, funny woman who adores football, poker, dirty jokes, and burping, who plays video games, drinks cheap beer, loves threesomes and anal sex, and jams hot dogs and hamburgers into her mouth like she's hosting the world's biggest culinary gangbang, while somehow maintaining a size 2. Because cool girls are above all hot and understanding. Cool girls never get angry. They only smile in a chagrined, loving manner and let their men do whatever they want. These are just some of the requirements of women according to Amy. These requirements are definitely contradictory, as evident in this example, all of which makes being a woman and dating challenging. So it's a little hard to judge Amy because, coupled with her deep-seated insecurities about herself, she convinced herself that her gender performance of hyperfemininity and masquerade as cool Amy, which was Amy's version of the cool girl, that all of this was necessary if she was to find someone to accept and love her. So here we see a female protagonist who engages in gender performance and masquerades of hegemonic femininity or hyperfemininity, trying to match up to social expectations of women and of her. Amy's performance as cool Amy was not her authentic expression of gender, but she had to engage in this gender performance because she couldn't gain love and acceptance without doing so. She would attract a lot of censure for expressing her authentic femininity, which didn't conform to patriarchal gender norms, making hers a pariah femininity. So she had to go to great lengths to hide her true self and present a hyper-feminine version to the world. But this masquerade wasn't sustainable, especially after she got married to Nick. When she slowly started shedding this persona of cool Amy, Nick was caught completely off guard. He described her change of personality in a jarring and rather insulting way. He felt that his old wife was slipping away, as if she had literally shed herself, a pile of skin and soul on the floor, and outstepped this new, brittle, bitter Amy, calling it an awful fairy tale reverse transformation. Amy, in turn, had an equally hateful reaction to Nick's reaction. I hated Nick for being surprised when I became me. I hated him for not knowing it had to end, for truly believing he had married this creature, this figment of the imagination of a million masturbatory men, semen-fingered and self-satisfied. So while Amy was initially successful in using gender performance and masquerade of hegemonic femininity or hyperfemininity to attract Nick and then marry him, therefore conforming to patriarchal gender norms, she couldn't sustain this performance. His rejection of her true self was a huge blow to Amy. This rejection itself can be considered emotional abuse, and Amy did not take this rejection lightly. And in this way, the stage was set for endless conflict. The first two strategies failed in helping Amy conform to gender norms because her marriage was now on the rocks. So she pivoted to using a third strategy, that of inversion of normative feminine and masculine behavior. This was designed to reduce conflict and maintain some semblance of normalcy in their marriage, but it was not without its problems. For this strategy, I have a quote from Nick about a major point of contention in their relationship from the first year of marriage. But here's the context. Amy's parents were very much in love with each other, and each year, in a celebration of their love, Amy's father would set up an elaborate and romantic treasure hunt for his wife. In her marriage with Nick, Amy replicated this. But instead of Nick organizing the romantic treasure hunt, it was Amy who took the initiative. Nick hated this and interpreted this as one of Amy's mind games. Let's hear from the man himself. My wife loved games, mostly mind games, but also actual games of amusement. And for our anniversary, she always set up an elaborate treasure hunt. It was what her dad always did for her mom on their anniversary. And don't think I don't see the gender roles here, that I don't get the hint. Because of the gender roles in Amy's parents' relationship, with the man setting up the treasure hunt, Nick felt that organizing it was the man's role, so his role. So Amy organizing the romantic treasure hunt was interpreted by Nick as Amy forcibly assuming the dominant and masculine role in their relationship, thereby automatically relegating Nick into the feminine role. So when it came to the treasure hunt, their dynamic was such that Amy ended up enacting hegemonic masculinity, automatically pushing Nick into a complicit masculinity or even a male femininity. Either way, he was in a subordinated position to Amy. And because women can't even be a touch masculine, Amy's embodiment of hegemonic masculinity made her a pariah femininity. However, Nick feeling emasculated wasn't Amy's initial intention with the treasure hunt. In the early stages of their marriage, this was something special that she wanted to do with him, to celebrate their special moments and to have Nick celebrate how amazing she was. But because of Nick's upbringing with a misogynistic and abusive father, Nick subscribed to patriarchal beliefs about masculinity. So his wife making grand romantic gestures and also financially supporting him were all things that Nick had grown up believing would make him less of a man or not even a man at all. And this is why he constantly felt emasculated by Amy. Essentially, this strategy also failed in maintaining any semblance of normalcy in their marriage and also failed to reduce Amy's victimization and allow her to conform to gender norms. This is when we arrive at the fourth strategy of recognizing their victimhood. In their process of escaping their victimhood, this was the most crucial step, without which the female protagonist would be stuck in a cycle of victimization and violence. Now, recognizing their victimhood is a term I use in this research to refer to the point at which the female protagonists finally begin to come to terms with the fact that they are victims. What this looks like, however, depends on the female protagonist. The more vindictive ones may begin devising plans for revenge, while others may focus on healing their emotional scars. Amy is one of the vindictive ones. She had a long list of grievances against Nick, only some of them real, but in their 5 years of marriage, she had enough to be mad about. The final blow was finding out about his extramarital affair with the very young Andy Hardy. This is the moment that Amy recognized that she had become someone she had never wanted to be, a victim. So Amy entered the phase of recognizing her victimhood and came out of it with a lot of rage. Earning her reputation as a villainess, Amy's reaction to recognizing that she had been a victim of her husband was to become a perpetrator of even more violence. Her plan to punish Nick for his infidelity and all his other transgressions included an elaborately villainous plan where she framed him for her murder in a state where they give the death penalty for murder. I'm going to show you a quote from Amy talking about one of the most critical and diabolical parts of her plan to punish Nick that she titled "Fuck Nick Done." But first, some context. In her attempts to frame Nick, she created fake diary entries that slowly but progressively painted Nick as a domestic abuser and that she was 100% his victim. She went to great lengths to make these entries as believable as possible. The intended audience of these entries were the police, and she hoped that these diary entries would be enough evidence to put Nick behind bars. And because Amy loved creating and labeling her new identities, she called this fake diary version of herself Diary Amy. I hope you liked Diary Amy. She was meant to be likable, meant for someone like you, the reader, to like her. She's easy to like. I had to maintain an affable if somewhat naive persona, a woman who loved her husband and could see some of his flaws. Otherwise she'd be too much of a sap, but was sincerely devoted to him, all the while leading the reader, in this case the cops, I am so eager for them to find it, toward the conclusion that Nick was indeed planning to kill me. You can see just how vindictive and hateful she was towards Nick. So for Amy, when the previous strategies of gender performance, masquerade, and inversion of normative feminine and masculine behavior didn't work in stopping her being victimized, she finally reached the point where she recognized her own victimhood and reacted with anger and hatred. She was intent on teaching Nick a lesson. After recognizing their victimhood and understanding that they have to escape their role of victim somehow, the female protagonists of domestic noir move towards the fifth and final strategy of violence. This violence can either be premeditated or it can be in the moment in self-defense. Either way, it's a response to being victimized by their male abuser. What's interesting about the female protagonists using violence to literally or symbolically silence their male abusers is that this is a subversion of gendered roles in traditional crime fiction, where the victim is always a woman and the perpetrator is always a man. Often the female protagonists use what is typically known as male violence. What this generally means is that it is very violent and there is a lot of blood. Amy uses both male violence and female violence. An example of her male violence is how she murdered Daisy Collins. She had reached out to Daisy for help and he eventually ended up holding her hostage. Unhappy at this loss of power, Amy made a decision. She would escape Daisy by murdering him. I still have Daisy's semen inside me from the last time he raped me, so the medical examination goes fine. My rope-wreathed wrists, my damaged vagina, my bruises, the body I present them is textbook. Police have been dispatched to Daisy's home, where they'll find him naked and drained, a stunned look on his face, a few strands of my hair in his clutches, the bed soaked in blood. The knife I used on him and on my bonds will be nearby on the floor where I dropped it. In her attempts to escape Daisy, she seduced him, lulling him into a false sense of security. She then stabbed him repeatedly until he was drained of blood, and then arranged everything just so to convince the police that he had raped her and that she had killed him in self-defense, when in fact he had never raped her and his murder had been very much premeditated. She had planned it for days, injuring herself in such a way to support her story of being abducted, held hostage, and continuously raped by a very violent man. This is an example of how Amy tended to use self-victimization as a tool to punish others by exerting physical violence upon herself so that she could frame others for acts of physical and sexual violence committed against her. Furthermore, this elaborate production allowed Amy to engage in performative victimhood, masquerading as the victim of an abductor and a rapist, and then play the role of the woman who heroically fought off her abuser and lived to tell the tale. Anyway, after this heroic act of escape, because that's how she frames it, she triumphantly returns to Nick, who by this point is aware of Amy's elaborate plan to punish him. And he's determined to divorce her, get as far away as possible from her as possible, and reveal Amy's true evil nature to the whole world. To this effect, he started writing his version of what occurred. Faced with this threat of her carefully laid plans being destroyed, she had to devise ways to silence him. Luckily for Amy, she had been prepared for just this sort of thing. There were multiple tricks she used to blackmail him into silence, but her trump card was her pregnancy. She impregnated herself by using Nick's sperm that she had held onto, knowing that Nick would never abandon his child because he'd always wanted to be a father. Using her pregnancy and a future child as a negotiation strategy, she forced Nick to never publicize his side of the story. By engaging in reproductive coercion, which is an act of violence, Amy was able to resume control over Nick. She was back in power. I want to draw your attention to a wonderful quote by Amy which highlights how she used her performative victimhood to not only symbolically silence Nick and safeguard her own future, but to also profit from her performative victimhood. I have a book deal. I am officially in control of our story. It feels wonderfully symbolic. Isn't that what every marriage is anyway? Just a lengthy game of he said, she said. Well, she is saying, and the world will listen, and Nick will have to smile and agree. I will write him the way I want him to be, romantic and thoughtful and very, very repentant. If I can't get him to say it out loud, he'll say it in my book. Then he'll come on tour with me and smile and smile. These were some of my findings about Amy Dunn from Gillian Flynn's novel Gone Girl, about the strategies that Amy used in her attempts to cope with and then to escape the abuse she experienced from her male partners. In conclusion, I want to draw your attention to 3 important points. Amy's journey from victim to perpetrator clearly demonstrates how, through the use of these 5 strategies, female protagonists of domestic noir actually end up subverting patterns found in traditional crime fiction and the larger crime fiction genre in general. This is especially evident when it comes to violence, with female protagonists' use of male violence that allows them to regain their agency. One of the main things that domestic noir really highlights is the complexity of the concept of victimhood, and especially female victimhood. However hard it is to view Amy as a victim of male abuse, that is what she is. But her reactions to these acts of abuse and the acts of violence she engaged in retaliation may seem way out of proportion in comparison to the violence she experienced. And while some of her uses of violence may seem over the top, and this is true most of the time, this shows that anyone can be a victim. And that despite whatever Amy may have done in retaliation, that doesn't negate her position as a victim. This also demonstrates how victims can simultaneously be perpetrators of violence as well. And this applies to all the female protagonists of domestic noir. And this is where the concept of agency also comes in. Not all of the female protagonists of domestic noir start out with, continue to have, and eventually end up with the same amount of agency. Characters like Amy had more privilege to begin with, and even at the end, they managed to retain more agency than other female protagonists of other domestic noir novels. So even when the female protagonists complete the process in terms of engaging in all the 5 strategies to escape their victimhood and regain their agency, not every female protagonist is successful, and of those who are, they are not all similarly agentic. And this brings me to the end of my talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Enakshi, for that wonderfully lucid and insightful presentation. So rather frightening as well, with some points, very pertinent points that are raised. So now we are opening the floor to questions. If you have any questions, please raise your hand using the raise your hand function on this page, or you can also type your question in the chat box.
I just want to make this one little comment. I would prefer if it's typed in the chat box, because I do have, why am I forgetting the name? Auditory processing disorder. So that makes me technically hard of hearing. I can hear quite well, but it's just when it's, over like this virtually sort of it, and because of people's internet connections, different accents, it's going to take me a little longer to understand what's being said. So, yeah, it's fine if people ask questions vocally, but it'll take me a little extra time to process what's being said. Yes, just wanted to add that.
Okay. Perhaps people are ruminating. While they're ruminating, I have a few questions that have popped up, but I'll start with one.
Okay.
Can you tell us, is it okay if I speak? Would you be able to?
Yes, I can hear you very clearly.
Yeah, okay.
Because you're very close to the speaker, I think, yeah. The microphone, sorry.
Can you tell us a little bit about your process of selecting the texts? And I'm particularly interested in Asian/Southeast Asian domestic noir. And in the process of selecting your text, did you come up against or come across texts from this region or from the Asian region in general? And if so, how would you situate those texts within the larger field of domestic noir?
Okay, right. So in terms of can you hear me? Yes, okay. So in terms of the selection of text, so apart from Gillian Flynn's Gone Girl, I also picked A.S.A. Harrison's The Silent Wife and Paula Hawkins's The Girl on the Train. So these are all by white Western authors, all female. The reason I chose them is, one, they are very popular and they are really like excellent examples of the subgenre itself. And sorry, just lost my train of thought. Yes, so they're excellent examples, and one of the main reasons I picked these 3 particular texts is also because my criteria, I had 3 major criteria for selecting them. So there has to be a wife who is being abused by her husband. And then there has to be a masculine, like a male protagonist who is enacting hegemonic masculinity. And then the final criteria is that she responds to this, the domestic violence that she experiences with violence. So I read a lot of domestic noir novels in preparation for this, trying to figure out which one was the best fit. And also based on the existing literature at the time. So when I initially started working on this topic, that was in 2017, during my master's, there was very little written on the topic. So it was mainly me reading a lot of these novels and choosing these three texts based on based on my criteria. Because I was very focused on analyzing the aspects of female violence, female agency, and female victimhood. So that's about the selection of texts. So in terms of other regions, non-Western regions having domestic noir novels, there are plenty. And I want to point out that just because Gone Girl in 2012 revolutionized this, kind of concept of, female protagonists in a crime fiction novel who experiences domestic violence, and in like this cathartic way, she ends up punishing him. It isn't exactly a new concept. If you look at like The Yellow Wallpaper or Rebecca, you have similar themes. They may not be exactly punishing, but in Rebecca, you can see that the male protagonist is punished by his previous wife. So I'm sorry, I don't remember the names, but so that does. So this kind of novel isn't new, but in 2012, because of the kind of political and kind of the social movements that were happening, and because of that, this kind of really got highlighted. And so in the West, this is mainly in the West in crime fiction, people started talking about this as this amazing new thing, and we have to call it something new. Do we call it domestic noir? Do we call it chick noir? Because there are similarities to chick lit as well. Victoria Kennedy, who wrote about this really early on, described domestic noir as what happens after the chick lit novel ends. But the thing is, the idea of domestic noir as a subgenre is kind of a very Western idea. But if you look at novels pretty much in any other region, right? Even in Eastern Europe, you'll see, Eastern Europe, South America, Africa, all over Asia, you'll see that there are novels that fit into this category. Sri Lankan novels like Rue Freeman's A Disobedient Girl, Karen Roberts' The Lament of the Dobie Woman fit into this category. But the thing is, this is what usually happens when you have female protagonists and women writing novels. They fall into this category of women's fiction and just shove it into a corner. So this is what has happened to a lot of these novels. So you will see these same themes as in Gone Girl in a lot of novels predating 2012, but they aren't categorized as such. Definitely the two novels that I mentioned, A Disobedient Girl and The Lament of the Dobie Woman, by the way, brilliant novels if you can find them, but they are categorized as women's fiction and literary fiction. But even though there's the whole crime kind of aspect, it doesn't really get that label as domestic noir, although it definitely fits. So that is one of the problems. So it has become basically a very Western concept.
I see. And there are similarities across, so similarities between the texts that you found from these other regions and the Western genre of domestic noir. That's
Yes,
future work, isn't it? You've got your post-doctoral work set up for you.
Yes, it's really interesting, yeah.
All right, thanks very much, Enakshi. Okay, we've got a question from Melissa. Shall I read it out? I think I'll read it out for everybody else. Great talk, Enakshi. Why do you think these themes are so prevalent across the novels, both in your data set and other books?
Okay, thank you for the compliment and the question, Dr. Melissa. So that mainly has to do with the fact that, again, domestic noir novels focus very much on women's lived experience. And if there's one thing that domestic noir discusses and focuses on, it's primarily domestic violence or intimate partner violence. And these are pretty much universal problems. There is not a single country, a single community where you can really find that is free of this sort of thing. And I think that is definitely why that these themes are so prevalent across the novel. So even if you take a South American novel, whether it's categorized as domestic noir, whether it fits the 3 basic criteria that I mentioned, and you take a Sri Lankan novel, or you take a Malaysian novel, Eastern European, African, anywhere, it's because domestic violence is the common theme across all of this. And domestic violence or intimate partner violence has been described as an epidemic because it occurs so much, and that's why. Yeah, and I want to add that domestic noir novels, it is. I mean, it's not entirely realistic, not always. You don't, even in The Silent Wife, which is one of the other novels that I study. So the female protagonist ends up hiring someone to kill her husband. So that, that means that she doesn't have any more financial difficulties because she is now entitled to all of his wealth. And so problem solved for her. And now she doesn't have to suffer from his abuse either. Sorry, what was I? Right, but so this is not entirely realistic, because chances are women, if they do punish their male abusers, whether they're husbands or boyfriends or ex-boyfriends, ex-husbands, whatever, usually they are tried in court and it doesn't go well for women. But you can see that there's a huge disparity. Cases of domestic violence and murder, all that against men, don't even go to trial a lot of the time. See statistics about rape and sexual assault, or in cases of domestic violence. So these domestic noir novels also, they're a little kind of cathartic also. That is also why I think there's no research on this, but based on what I've heard about, what I've discussed, and my personal experience, is that in a world where it feels kind of like you are powerless in a way because you're battling against this whole patriarchal system where you can't seem to win as a woman or someone of any other gender, like non-men. So books like this can be very cathartic. Yes. That was just something that I wanted to add about domestic noir novels.
It's really interesting that you mentioned that last point, because I was going to ask you what makes violence the ideal or even the only option. I ask this as well for selfish reasons, because the current novel that I'm writing has women being aggressive, being violent. The reason why, and really violent. So I'm wondering whether there's noir elements, there are noir elements in what I'm writing. Whether it's called domestic noir, probably, it could probably be categorized as domestic noir, hence my earlier question. But the reason why they resort to violence, or at least in how I've depicted it, is because the systems, the larger social system doesn't quite allow them to express their agency in other ways that are going to be as effective. So violence then becomes a means, kind of like the only means, but there's also a particular psychological profile that goes with the characters who do that, because there are other female characters who don't resort to violence, they resort to other, means of expressing themselves. So I was wondering whether you noticed that kind of psychological profiling. There's certain characters, you mentioned at the end of your talk actually, but there's some characters who are able to follow through with their acts of violence, right up until murder or whatever, the destruction. Is there anything that you noticed in terms of the psychological profile of the characters who do it, who do see, because they're powerless, they have to use violence? And are there other factors that go into this, the ones who become very violent?
Right. So in terms of the violence, it can be one of two things, right? So one, it can be premeditated. And the other thing is that it can be in the spur of the moment in self-defense. So Amy from Gone Girl is one of those premeditated violent sort of person. And if you look at another novel that I'm looking at, The Girl on the Train, you have the character Rachel, who had been abused for years by her ex-husband. And in this one, towards the end, she ends up being held hostage by him. And she recognized, like, she ended up killing him, the ex-husband Tom. And it's not because that she wanted to, but because she knew that that only one of them would come out of this alive. She knew he was going to kill her, that he was just playing with her the way a cat would play with a mouse before dealing the final blow. So for her, it was in the spur of the moment, she decided, I have to do something, and only one of us will make out of this alive, and I would like to be the one who is alive. So there are ones who fall into that sort of category as well. But when it's the premeditated sort of violence, there are a lot of factors that fall into it. In this, the final theory that I discussed, Suzanne C. Swan? And sorry, the final theory is a sociological theory that analyzes real life cases of domestic violence. But I use in my research because they actually provide a lot of interesting a lot of insight into why women engage in violence. And because domestic noir is inspired by or based on real events, so it really does apply. So I didn't present the model here because it's a lot and didn't really have the time. So, but when it comes to violence, there are a lot of factors that these two mention based on research for over many years. Childhood trauma is one. It can be anything from sexual or violent, physical violence to emotional, verbal violence. That can really negatively impact the character. So you have Amy, again, I didn't have time to discuss this, but Amy's parents were very focused on making Amy enact this idealized American girlhood. But this was a real struggle for Amy because, I mean, her femininity, her expression, authentic expression of gender is a combination of what we think of as normative femininity and normative masculinity. So it's a combination. She's, like most people. So, but her parents wanted her to enact this specific type of girlhood, and they rejected her authentic expression of gender. So that did really damage her in terms of, it taught her that she wasn't enough. And that's where she learned the lesson that she had to create new identities for herself. That's where Diary Amy came from. Before that, she had Amazing Amy, she had Cool Amy, she had other types of Amys. So childhood trauma is a huge important part. And apart from that, there's also the aspects of mental illness. It can be as a result of the abuse. It can be mental illness that they've been suffering from before being abused. So it's kind of like a cyclical sort of thing. You end up struggling more with mental illness. I do want to add that mental illness does not automatically mean that you're going to be violent. People with mental illness generally pose more of a danger to themselves than to other people. So pretty much most people with mental illness are harmless. But you have all kinds of people. So like Amy, again, I didn't have time to discuss this, but she is a narcissist. She's a full-blown narcissist. So that aspect, she has narcissistic personality disorders. So that is why she goes to such great lengths to engage in violence. But in other female protagonists of other domestic noir novels, you may see characters like her, but generally you see characters who are trying to defend themselves in the moment. It's not very common to see a lot of premeditated violence, definitely not at the level of Gone Girl. Because just one more thing about Amy as a character, Gillian Flynn has long talked about how she is tired of women being portrayed as these demure, just this very two-dimensional characters that you see in crime fiction. And she said that she wants to see in books and in movies real bad, horrible women. I want to see real villains and not the kind of villains you see as the femme fatale in noir, because again, they're very two-dimensional and they're there to kind of show us how brave and amazing and macho the male protagonist of noir and hard-boiled detective fiction are. So one of the reasons that Amy and most of the female protagonists of Gillian Flynn's novels are so obviously villainous is because she wants to change how we look at female villains and villainesses. She wants to introduce these stories where women can just be bad as well, because we don't really have that. If you look at older novels, you always see, especially in traditional crime fiction, where you have male protagonists, the female characters are just secondary, and you have this virginal sort of character, and the femme fatale who is, sexualized, or she's the bad woman. So it's kind of showing how you have to be this virginal, sort of woman, and anything other than that is bad. So it was just a propaganda sort of thing. So that is kind of where Amy comes in as well. Did I answer the question?
Yes, you very much did. Thank you so much, Enakshi. Thank you for your presentation. Thank you for your very generous answers. And thank you, everybody, for attending. And we have recorded this. So if you want to listen to it again, or if you want to share it, Enakshi, with friends or other researchers, it'll be up on our School of English YouTube page. Yes, we have a YouTube page. All right. Have a lovely weekend, everybody, and take care.
Thank you.